Today we will be covering the space race, from the creation of rocket technology to the moon landings of the late 1960s. The space race was a technological and ideological battle between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both countries were racing to prove that they were the most advanced in terms of technology by pushing their space programs to achieve things that were seen as impossible only a few years before. Rockets were first invented in ancient China to be used to propel arrows at great speeds during battle. That technology then spread throughout Eurasia with the help of the Mongols, and other countries began developing improvements to the initial design. In the 17th century, the iron-cased rocket was first invented, which allowed for greater aerodynamics, but it was much heavier than previous designs. The first liquid-fueled rocket was developed by Robert Goddard in 1926 in the United States. In 1957, as the Cold War began to escalate, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite. This caused many Americans to panic, since it appeared that the Soviet Union was advancing more quickly than the US and would soon have the capability to attack from space. President Eisenhower responded to the launch of Sputnik by speeding up the US space program, which led to the launch of the United States' first satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit on January 31st, 1958. Eisenhower also increased U.S. efforts in the space race by creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration on July 29, 1958, in order for the U.S. to have its own space program that wasn't part of another organization. On April 12, 1961, the Soviet Union launched Vostok 1, which was the world's first manned spacecraft. It carried Yuri Gagarin, who became the first person in space. 1 month later, the United States launched the first mission of its Mercury program, which carried Alan Shepard to space aboard the Freedom 7 capsule. This was followed by 5 more single-passenger Mercury missions. On April 12, 1962, President John F. Kennedy gave his iconic "We Choose to Go to the Moon" speech, which challenged NASA to place a man on the moon by the end of the decade. To accomplish this goal, NASA first had to learn how to operate various systems in space. This led to the creation of the Project Gemini, which would launch spacecraft which each carried 2 crew members instead of just 1 like the Mercury program. Gemini tested orbital rendezvous, docking, and other operations. In 1965, however, the Soviet Union gained another lead on the United States by completing the first spacewalk in orbit around the Earth on the Voskhod 2 mission. Spacewalks were essential for the moon program, since they would be necessary to conduct the experiments that NASA was planning. Soon after this feat, the Gemini 4 mission carried out the United States' first spacewalk, which was done by astronaut Ed White. Another key aspect of the moon plans was the ability to dock 2 spacecraft in orbit. This was first done aboard the Gemini 8 mission, when Commander Neil Armstrong and pilot David Scott docked the Gemini spacecraft with the Agena vehicle, whose sole purpose was to be a docking target. The final Gemini mission, Gemini 12, concluded the Gemini program by proving that astronauts could effectively work outside of their spacecraft, and also dock successfully with an Agena target vehicle. NASA's third and final manned spaceflight program of the 1960s was the Apollo program, which was designed to land people on the moon. At the same time, the Soviet Union began to build its N-1 moon rocket in an attempt to beat the US there. Apollo 1 was supposed to be a test flight of the Apollo spacecraft in low Earth orbit, but during testing on the ground, a fire broke out within the capsule, killing all 3 crew members. While this was seen as a major setback for the program, it helped to expose major design flaws with the capsule, including the use of 100% oxygen atmosphere inside the vehicle, which was then switched to including nitrogen after the accident. Alongside the development of the crew vehicle for Apollo, NASA was developing a rocket to take a crew and lander to the moon, the Saturn V. The first time that both the Apollo command module, with the crew on board, and the Saturn V launched together was on the Apollo 8 mission around the moon. This was the furthest that humans had ever gone before. This mission was a critical systems test of the command module, service module, and the Saturn V. It also proved that it was possible for humans to travel through the Van Allen radiation belts surrounding the Earth. Following Apollo 8, Apollo 9 and Apollo 10 continued to test systems and to make improvements to the vehicle as a whole. On board Apollo 10, astronauts Thomas Stafford and Eugene Cernan piloted the lunar landing module, nicknamed Snoopy, away from the command module, and a critical test that made sure that the lunar lander functioned properly, before docking to the command module once again for the astronauts' return to Earth. As the U.S. continued its moon landing efforts, the Soviet Union continued to work on its own moon rocket, the N-1. Unfortunately for the Soviets, however, each test of the N-1 resulted in failure. The culmination of the space race occurred on July 20th, 1969. On that day, Apollo 11's Eagle lander, carrying astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, touched down on the moon, marking the first time in history that a human has landed on another celestial body. The U.S. also succeeded in bringing all 3 Apollo 11 astronauts home safely, fulfilling former President Kennedy's goal and bringing an end to the space race.